In 1968, the Pritchard's daughter, Diane, turned 15, and the entity that was living in the house, it would seem, had finished recharging its batteries, so to speak, and was ready to play. So, around this time, the Pritchards were redecorating Diane's bedroom, out with the rainbows and unicorns, and in with posters of her favourite pop stars. Now, it seems to be a common theme with hauntings that activity seems to spike whenever there are renovations or construction work going on. So, one weekend, Sarah had popped over for a visit. Jean was in one of the bedrooms doing some decorating. Sarah was leaning against the doorframe, cup of tea in hand of course, while Jean was on the stepladders trying to reach those awkward top corners with the paintbrush. Now, Sarah casually mentions, "You know it's August bank holiday again soon, right?" And Jean's like, "Yeah, and what of it?" sort of thing. And Sarah goes, "I've been hearing the knocking again, Jean." And Jean's like, "Mum, it's been 2 years now. Whatever it was is gone. I haven't heard anything, so please, let's just leave it." Well, clearly, something in the house was listening. Jean goes to Sarah, "I'm going to go and stick the kettle on. Do you want another cuppa?" So they both head down to the kitchen for a drink. When they leave the kitchen to head back upstairs, they both stopped in their tracks as they noticed that a blanket was now sitting at the bottom of the stairs. Sarah looks at Jean and says, "Are you sure it's gone?" Jean just huffs, clearly shaken, but trying not to show it. She picks the blanket up and they both head back upstairs. So they're both chatting away in the bedroom as Jean carries on painting, when they both hear an almighty crash from somewhere outside in the hallway. They head out of the bedroom to notice that not only was another blanket now sitting at the bottom of the stairs, but all of the plant pots had been thrown over, soil everywhere, all in the carpet, up the walls. It was a right mess. And later that night, Jean saw the Cobra. Okay, so it wasn't actually a cobra. You definitely don't get cobras in Yorkshire. So Jean's in bed, wide awake, stressing about the events from earlier in the day. She can't sleep, so she gets up to use the bathroom. She walks out of the bedroom into the hallway, which is pitch black, well, apart from some very faint moonlight shining in through a window. As her eyes adjust to the darkness, she notices some movement across the hallway. She's rubbing her eyes trying to focus, and she's thinking, what the fuck is that? So she reaches for the light switch on the wall. She flicks the switch, and literally, as soon as the light comes on, she throws her hands up to guard her face as a paintbrush came flying across the hallway and hits the wall right beside her head. As she's staring at the paintbrush on the floor in disbelief, like, what the fuck is going on? A bucket of wallpaper paste smashes against the wall, sending paste everywhere. Like, this poltergeist just loves making a mess. And then she sees what that movement was before she'd switched the light on. And this is mad, this is. So, a strip of wallpaper, which was on the floor, was just being held up and it was just swaying side to side like a fucking cobra, taunting Jean basically. It seemed like it was taking the piss out of her. So she reaches for the wallpaper trying to grab a hold of it, but the second she lunges for it, it drops to the floor as if to say, "You'll need to be quicker than that, love." She backs up against the wall when a whole roll of wallpaper flies towards her, again hitting the wall beside her head. Now, either the poltergeist was just trying to scare Jean but not actually harm her, or our poltergeist has the accuracy of a stormtrooper. Well, at this point, Jean has had enough, and she just screams and cries, waking up the rest of the family. So Joe runs out of the bedroom to see what all the commotion is. Philip and Diane open their bedroom doors too, and in front of the whole family, tools, paintbrushes, rolls of wallpaper are just flying all over the place, like they were all now witnessing full-blown poltergeist activity right in front of them, and not one of them could deny it. After witnessing the activity firsthand, Joe finally accepted it, and he was like, "Okay, I'm sorry for not believing you all. First thing tomorrow I'll call a priest to come and bless the house. I'm sure that will help." Well, not exactly. So the priest, Reverend Davy, I believe he was called, turned up at the house, and the second the front door opened, he could sense just this overwhelming feeling of oppression. There was just dread and fear seeping through every fibre of this house. He stepped inside, removed his hat and coat, and explored the property. Mr. and Mrs. Pritchard, I'm afraid to tell you there is indeed a very powerful dark entity within your home. We need to bless this house immediately. And just as he finished speaking, a brass candle holder levitated from the side and flew towards his face, crashing against the wall just beside him. Panicked, Davy turned to the couple and said, "I'm so sorry, I can't help you here. This is way beyond my expertise." And at that, the priest fled the house and drove away. Now, it was around this time that the family would start to refer to the entity as Mr. Nobody or Fred, whereas the entity would become better known to the public by another name, the Black Monk of Pontefract, and we're about to discover just why. Up until this point, the poltergeist had never revealed itself. It was just this invisible force that liked to cause chaos, but it never physically manifested. Well, that was about to change. One night, Diane had been downstairs in the living room. She'd stayed up late watching TV on her own. She decided she was tired, got up, turned the TV and the light off and walked out into the hall. As she got into the hallway, she noticed that the temperature had dramatically plummeted, like someone had turned the air conditioning on full blast. The problem was, they didn't have air conditioning. So she reached the stairs and looked upwards towards the top of the stairs. Now, at the top of the stairs is a large grandfather clock. Well, next to the grandfather clock stood a large, hooded, black figure. And to say that Diane was paralysed with fear would be an understatement. So she quickly snapped out of her trance and scrambled for the light switch on the wall. She hit the switch, but nothing happened. If anything, the area seemed to grow darker and colder. At that moment, a large, heavy cabinet in the hallway was launched towards Diane, pinning her against the stairs, and she screamed at the top of her voice. Now, I'm not sure where Joe was at this point. Maybe he was at work, maybe at the pub, but it would be Jean and Philip who would rush to Diane's aid. So Diane was pushing with all her might to get this thing off her, but it just wouldn't budge an inch. Even when Jean and Philip tried to pull the cabinet off her, it still wouldn't budge. Now, this cabinet was large and heavy, but between the three of them, Philip was 17 at this point, so he wasn't exactly a kid anymore. They should realistically have been able to move it, but nothing was working. They said it felt as though the entity was actually holding the cabinet in place and refusing to let go. Jean could see that Diane was really starting to panic now. No shit, Sherlock. She's been pinned to the stairs with a large piece of furniture by an evil poltergeist. So Jean told Diane to try to calm down and relax, and eventually Diane did sort of calm down, probably because she was exhausted, the poor thing. And when she did finally relax, the poltergeist seemed to relax its grip too, and just like that, they were able to push the cabinet aside. So now, the Black Monk of Pontefract seemed to have chosen Diane as its primary target. She was probably the youngest and weakest person in the house, so it makes sense to target her, right? Well, the Black Monk wasn't finished with Diane yet, and would continue its assault further into the night. So, on 4 separate occasions that very night, as Diane lay in bed, her quilt was torn away from her and her mattress was flipped over, with her on it, sending her flying to the floor. This was getting dangerous now, but the worst was still to come. But before we talk more about Diane's terrifying encounters with the monk, we need to talk about the gloves incident, which is perhaps one of the most bizarre examples of paranormal activity I have ever heard. So, the Pritchards had invited some family members over to sing hymns and recite prayers in an attempt to drive the entity out of the house. Now, one of the aunts was particularly sceptical about the haunting. Well, that was until she witnessed something that scared the absolute shit out of her. So, the family were in the middle of a rendition of Onward Christian Soldiers, when a pair of the aunt's fur gloves appeared to rise from a table. The group watched in horror as the gloves appeared to move in a way that suggested the poltergeist was kind of conducting the choir, so to speak. It was like it was saying, recite your prayers, sing your songs, I am going nowhere. And that definitely seemed to be the case. When the aunt left the house that night, she left as a believer in the paranormal, specifically the Pontefract poltergeist, and it's been reported that she burned those very gloves. Now, let's get back to Diane and her encounters with the poltergeist. So, up until this point, the poltergeist hadn't really hurt Diane. I mean, sure, it had tipped that cabinet on top of her, and although it pinned her down, it didn't actually cause her any harm. And even tipping her out of bed, it didn't actually hurt her. The first time the poltergeist actually showed willingness and the ability to cause harm came in the shape of a metal crucifix. So, Diane was getting ready for school one morning. She's standing in the front of a mirror brushing her hair. Not that I know what that feels like. When she felt something hit her hard in the back. She let out a scream, not knowing what had caused the sharp pain. Already on edge, Jean ran into the room panicking, screaming, "What's going on? What's happened?" Diane turned to her mum and said, "I don't know, I feel like I've just been smacked in the back." So Jean's like, "Okay, turn around and let me have a look." As Diane turned around, Jean watched in horror as a brass crucifix dropped from Diane's back and landed on the floor. It was described as if the crucifix had stuck to Diane's back like a magnet, leaving a crucifix-shaped bruise which lasted for 4 days. But that wasn't the worst of it for poor Diane. Oh no, no. But first, let's talk about the incident where Joe and Jean came face to face with the Black Monk of Pontefract for the very first time. So, one night, the couple were getting ready for bed. Joe had already gotten into bed, and Jean was just finishing in the bathroom. Then she came in, switched the light off, climbed into bed next to Joe, gave him a kiss, said goodnight, shuffled her pillow, then pulled the blanket over her to settle down to sleep. Well, just as she was about to drift off, she heard a noise from out in the hallway. She nudged Joe in the back. Joe, who was already asleep, was just like, what do you want? Jean said, "Shh, listen." There was a few seconds of silence before the footsteps started. It was like a shuffling sound, almost like someone wearing slippers. It came down the hallway and stopped just outside the bedroom door. The couple were unsure at this point whether it was one of the kids or something else. They sat up in bed and watched the door. The door creaked open slowly. Jean grabs Joe's arm and squeezes in fear. Standing there, in the doorway, was a towering figure in a black, hooded monk's habit. They could see no face, just a pitch-black void where a face should be. The entity just seemed to stand there for a few seconds. Although it had no visible face or eyes, they knew it was staring straight at them. And then, just like that, the Black Monk of Pontefract slowly turned and walked away. Joe, the tough-as-nails coal miner, eventually became a target himself. Like the entity was growing, becoming more powerful, and it would assert its dominance over the family by going for the strongest family member. So, one day, Joe was down in the coal house, under the stairs, just having a bit of a clean and tidy down there, when he noticed his high-visibility jacket, you know, the bright orange or yellow ones that workmen wear. Well, that was on the floor, buried in a pile of coal. So, pissed off, wondering who had thrown his coat down in the coal, he picked it up and turned to leave. As he stepped towards the door slammed shut in his face, and no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't open it, despite there being no lock on that door. To this day, no one really knows what happened to Joe down there or how long he was trapped in there, as he refused to go into detail. But we do know that when he finally got out, he was covered head to toe in bruises physically. But mentally, something happened in that coal house that day that changed him. It was like the poltergeist, the Black Monk of Pontefract, had taken something from him, taken a piece of him. But the defining moment, the incident that proved to be the breaking point for the Pritchard family, was the night the lights went out, and Diane, along with her mother and brother, would experience something they'd never forget. Diane was in the hallway downstairs. She was just about to take her first step onto the stairs when suddenly the lights went out. Jean and Philip, who were both in the living room at the time, heard a blood-curdling scream coming from the hallway and ran out to see what was going on. Now, Diane was being physically dragged up the stairs by something that none of them could see. Colin Wilson, who documented the events in his book, noted that Diane's cardigan was stretched out in front of her, as if the monk was pulling on it with one hand while choking her throat with the other. Roused by her screams and gasps for air, Philip and Jean rushed to pull Diane back down the stairs. However, they were both repelled, thrown back by what felt like large, clawed hands. Now, at this point, Diane is desperately fighting for her life. She can't breathe and she's literally on the verge of blacking out. And for some reason, fortunately for Diane, the poltergeist decided to release its grip and Diane was freed. Diane let out a huge gasp for air and clutched her throat as she sobbed. The ordeal had left her with large red handprints on her throat where the invisible force had been gripping her so tightly. When Joe finally returned home and he saw what the Black Monk of Pontefract had done to his little girl, he declared that they were going to rid the house of this poltergeist once and for all. One of Joe's friends had recently returned from Scotland, and he recounted how people there hung garlic over doors and windows to keep the spirits out. And Joe thought, well, it's got to be worth a try. At this point, the family were willing to try just about anything. And much to the family's surprise, the garlic trick actually seemed to work. The activity diminished, eventually disappearing altogether by May of 1969. When author Colin Wilson met with the Pritchards in 1980, he reported no ongoing activity, although close friends and family of the Pritchards would say that this wasn't entirely true. Although the activity was nowhere near as frequent and extreme as it was in 1966 and 1968, it was still there. Joe died in that house in 86. He was found unresponsive on the bathroom floor, presumably having suffered a heart attack. Jean stayed in the house for years, but she lived like a prisoner, locking the living room doors every night just to keep the Black Monk at bay. Now, there is so much more to talk about, but I really want to wrap this up because this was only supposed to be a 25-minute episode. But there are a few seriously creepy instances that we still need to talk about. So, the last conversation Jean had with one of the neighbours was with Carol, the woman who lived next door, and this was in 2008. So Jean basically said to Carol she was putting the house up for sale, she couldn't take it in there on her own anymore, the activity in the house is really strong, basically she just needs to get out of there. And Carol, the neighbour, said, well, obviously, we'll be sad to see you go, but do you think you should make potential buyers aware of exactly what they're committing to here? Anyway, they finally said their goodbyes and that was that. Carol would still see Jean from time to time, but eventually she would just hear her next door, she'd hear her moving around, hear the TV blaring at night, and hear the pet parrot squawking. Well, one day, Philip turned up at the house. Carol saw him approaching and thought she'd go out for a chat. She asked him how his mum is, and she said she doesn't see her anymore. She hears her from time to time, you know, the TV, the parrot, etc. And Philip just kind of stared at Carol for a second before he spoke. Carol, the house had been empty for months. My mum moved to a nursing home, and the parrot, well, he's been rehomed in a sanctuary. Carol, it's safe to say, was gobsmacked. So the current owner of 30 East Drive is a man called Bill Bungay, who also happened to direct the movie about the house when the lights went out. So one day, Bill was in the house cleaning the place, preparing to go back to London. He's in the kitchen, washing up, when he hears a clattering sound coming from a cupboard right next to him. And then he hears something behind him. So slowly, Bill turns around, not really knowing what to expect, but definitely hoping not to see a monk dressed in black robes. And guess what? There was absolutely nothing there. So Bill makes a huge sigh of relief. But then, out of nowhere, a domino comes flying towards his face, missing him by millimetres. See, I told you this poltergeist was a terrible aim. Anyway, before he left, Carol from next door popped around because she looks after the place while Bill is away. So, they're chatting away when Carol's granddaughter walks into the room and she's pretending to chew on like a fake display orange. Random, I know, but bear with me. So Carol's like, "Darling, don't bite that, put it back, where did you get it from?" To which the girl responded rather coldly, "The man in the kitchen dressed in black gave it to me." So yeah, that is creepy as hell. Wow, that was a lot of haunting, and that brings the episode or episodes to an end. I'd love to hear your thoughts on 30's Drive and the Black Monk of Pontefract. If this story got under your skin, please do me a favour. Hit the subscribe button and join me on this haunted journey. It helps me to keep digging into these darker corners. But for now, just make sure your own front door is locked tight. I'm your host, Severed Soul, and I'll see you in the next one.